Chapter 10 talks about child murder and infanticide. So here we're looking at incidents in which a child or an infant is the victim of the homicide. So infanticide refers to the killing of infants, and this was believed to be practiced by primitive people in nearly every culture and class of people since then. In 17th and 18th century France, fathers legally decided whether to let their children live or die. In the U.S., unmarried women, both past and present, have killed their babies due to the stigma associated with having children out of wedlock. Infants have been sacrificed for religious reasons, as a method of population control, and when their parents could not afford to raise them. And at times it's been acceptable to kill babies with birth defects or female babies. In present-day China, for example, female children are less valued. So children make up about 10 to 20% of all homicide victims in Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US. And as many as 6 children are killed each day in the US. In the 1990s, there was a study done of 26 high-income nations, and they found the homicide rate for children under 15 in the U.S. was 5 times higher than that for children in the other 5 countries combined. In Rio, on the other hand, 6 child homicides occur each day in the streets. The child homicide rate in Rio is 47 times greater than that in the U.S. So one type of child killing is called neonaticide. This is a killing of a newborn within the first 24 hours of his or her life. Most women who abandon their newborns are young, single, and have hidden their pregnancy. Many gave birth alone and the father is out of the picture. Common methods include strangulation and suffocation, followed by head trauma, drowning, exposure, and stabbing. Some have found that low birth weight, late or no prenatal care, and social and economic stresses are risk factors for neonaticide. And some mothers who commit neonaticide are also lacking in any formal education. In LA alone, 5 to 8 newborns are found each year. Many states, in order to combat this, have adopted safe haven laws. And between January 2001 and October 2005, 35 infants in California were turned over. Infanticide refers to the killing of an infant who is less than 1 year old, and homicide is the 15th leading cause of death for children in their first year of life. So the risk of homicide for a child is greatest in its first year. The risk is greatest in the first 4 months and in particular in the first day of life. Homicide rate for the first day of life is 10 times greater than at any other time in your life. 7.3% of all infant deaths occur on the day they are born. The UK and Australia define infanticide as a crime specifically committed by the mother in the first year of life, but US data includes both men and women. Up until a child is a week old, they're most likely to be killed by their mother, and after that, they're more likely to be killed by a male. Prolicide refers to the killing of one's offspring, and this includes infanticide and the killing of a fetus in utero. The more common term that's used is filicide, which is the killing of one's child. This does also include adult children and stepchildren. More often, though, prolicide is referring to minor children, so children that are under the age of 18. Children in the U.S. are far more likely to be killed by their parents than all other offenders combined. But from 1976 to 2002, 61% of child homicide victims under 5 were killed by their parents. And we see a similar pattern in the UK and Australia. Whether moms or dads are more likely to kill their children depends on some other information. So under the age of 5, fathers make up a slightly higher percentage than mothers, but it's really a negligible difference here. Some data from 30-year period in Chicago tells us that 32% of infants are killed by their fathers, while 44% were killed by their mothers. When we look at toddlers and preschoolers, though, we see a pretty similar rate between fathers and mothers. And then we have some data here about other countries and what are their rates, or who are they most likely to be killed by, a father or a mother. We also have child victims of filicide suicide. Right, so this is an instance where a filicide occurs and then the offender commits suicide. These victims tend to be older than children and parents. It's far more likely in these cases that the offender is a biological parent as opposed to a step-parent. Perpetrators of filicide suicide tend to kill all of their children, and parents who kill more than one of their children are more likely to commit suicide than those that kill only one. We do see some differences when a filicide suicide is committed by a mother versus a father. So fathers usually kill within the context of a separation or child custody disagreement. Mothers usually do so because they fear the children will have no one to care for them if they commit suicide. Familicide refers to the killing of a whole family. These are multi-victim homicides in which the offender kills his or her spouse or former spouse and at least one or more of either of their children. This is rarely committed by women. How are children murdered? So under the age of 5, they're most often killed by a personal weapon, hands, feet, and fists. Between 5 and 8 by firearms, and age 9 and older is also by firearms. So as the age increases, the likelihood of being killed with a firearm also increases. Firearm-related homicides for children under 15 is far greater in the U.S. than other countries. The Center for Disease Control did a study of the 26 wealthiest countries and found the U.S. firearm homicide rate was nearly 4 times that of all other countries combined in the early 90s. Firearms are the primary cause of child homicide in Australia, Finland, Germany, Israel, and Italy. 10 countries in this study had no firearm child homicides. And during that same time period, where these 10 countries had none, the U.S. had 957 child firearm homicides. The peak time of day for children to be the victims of a homicide is different than an adult. It tends to occur during daytime hours and during weekdays. Homicides of children under the age of 2 tend to increase in the winter because this may be a more stressful time for parents. Homicides of children 5 to 14 are higher in the summer. So they're out of school and there's more time for victimization, more opportunity. In terms of some other demographics, children ages 17 to 19 far outnumber those in other age categories, with very young children being the next highest risk. That's from birth to 4. At younger age, we see no difference based on sex. But when we look at ages 13 to 16 and 17 to 19, overwhelmingly these are males. School-age girls are more likely to be victims of sexually motivated abduction homicides. And homicide is the 3rd most common form of death for boys aged 13 to 17 and the 4th leading cause of death for teenage girls. In terms of race, we can see the rates here. For African American children, it's 9.11. For Hispanics, 5.0, and white children, 1.8. 15% of children in the U.S. are African American, but they outnumber other categories in the 3 oldest age groups. So is child homicide increasing or decreasing? This also varies by age. So when we look at infanticide, it nearly doubled from 4.3 in 1970 to 9.2 in 2000, and then it decreased back down to 7.8 in 2003. The DOJ reports 1,610 juveniles murdered in 2000, which is the lowest since 1985, and with a peak in 1993. For girls, the rate remained the same from 1980 to 1998 and then dropped. And for boys, it increased 11% between 84 and 93 before dropping to 8% in 2000. Who kills children? Child homicide is frequently committed by women, and the pattern again varies by age. Most child homicide victims are killed by adults, nearly 3/4 of them. Children killed by other children are most likely to be adolescents, so 40% of all homicides with victims between 12 and 17 are committed by other children. Stranger murders of children are very rare. As the age of the child increases, the odds of being murdered by a stranger increase. As children's age increases, they may be killed in the context of another crime, gang violence, drug deals, or confrontational homicides. In terms of acquaintances, when a child kills another child, it's usually a teen boy killing another teen boy. In the 90s, we saw great increases in these types of homicide, with 4 cities accounting for nearly 1/3 of all the juvenile homicide arrests in 1994. So what are the motivations here? Sociologists tend to see links among societal factors, social roles, and child homicide. And when we look at this on an aggregate level, we see different structural factors are associated with infant and child homicide. Homicides of children are highest in countries where women have more responsibility without assistance from fathers, where there's higher rates of illegitimacy, teen births, and divorce rates, in countries lacking social welfare programs. Infant homicide is higher in countries without social welfare problems, and child homicide is higher in places with larger percentages of racial minorities, greater poverty, and greater urbanization. A study in Ohio found some aggregate level factors linked to homicide were also related to child homicide at the individual level, and this is in Ohio. And they obtained this information by studying death certificates for children under the age of 8. Children of younger, poorly educated mothers who were unmarried at the time of the birth and who lived in a metropolitan area were at greater risk for homicide. Black children were also at greater risk, as were children of a low birth weight. Psychologists and psychiatrists are likely to label those who kill children as mentally ill. We may see this caused by Munchausen by proxy syndrome, which is a pretty controversial diagnosis. This is where a parent reports fictitious symptoms or causes symptoms in a person they take care of to gain attention. But this is a pretty rare disorder, and most of them do not actually kill their children. Postpartum depression, however, is believed to affect as many as 80% of women who give birth. Most cases are minor. Women's hormones are readjusting after giving birth, and it tends to last a few weeks. But 1% suffer from postpartum psychosis, where they lose the ability to tell what is real. They may have violent thoughts about the baby, but even still, only 4% of these women kill their babies. This postpartum psychosis is triggered by a rapid decline in hormones that cause a break with reality. Social conditions play a role here too, though. So we tend to romanticize motherhood, and yet women often have insufficient child care. The media is most likely to publicize cases like Andrea Yates, women who do not typically fit the stereotype of a woman who kills her child. Postpartum depression is not recognized as a legal defense in the U.S. The role of abuse in child homicide. Sometimes children are killed in the process of being abused. So a 1994 California study examined whether abuse is a risk factor, and murdered children were 3.14 times more likely to have come to the attention of social services because of abuse. However, more than half of murdered children have no history of abuse or maltreatment. It's possible, though, that many of these children do actually have a history of abuse or maltreatment, but they never come to the attention of social services. Also, these deaths may be incorrectly recorded as SIDS deaths. This occurs whenever a child younger than 1 dies with no viable explanation. Battered children are also not necessarily killed deliberately and may be an impulsive act. Children can also die as a result of neglect. So what happens to those who kill children? Well, Mann looked at a study of maternal filicide in 1993 and looked at women who killed their preschool children in 6 cities. 84% were charged with murder, 16% were charged with manslaughter. Manslaughter was the most common outcome, occurring in 43% of cases. Locke summarized 44 cases of children who died from violent shaking in North Carolina, and only 2 were sentenced to life in prison. 21 were sentenced to prison, and 18 cases there was no sentence ordered. So with these types of cases, there's often a lack of forensic evidence and witnesses. This makes these cases difficult to prosecute. And that wraps up the chapter on child murder and infanticide.